fog lay over the canals like old velvet when the oarsmen pulled their long, black blades through the water, each stroke whispering against the winter dark. Lanterns hung motionless from the proud gargoyles that guarded the Iron Bank's quay. The Titan's faint rumble traveled like thunder through the piled stone bones of bravos, so low it seemed not to enter the ear but the chest. Somewhere bells rang, high and sweet and far. In the prow, a torch lifted, and the men hauled upon their oars with the last, clean strength a cold morning leaves in a body. Robert Baratheon stood bareheaded in the fog and did not blink when the iron-jawed statues took him in. He did not look back when the boat scraped the quay. He did not wait for ceremony. He jumped onto the wet stone and stalked forward in boots that had tasted a dozen battlefields and more than 100 feasts. His heavy cloak flapped, seal-brown and fur-edged, hung with the damp that rose off water. Behind him, Jon Arryn climbed less quickly, as was fit for a man who carried both years and kingdoms upon his shoulders. Stannis Baratheon came last, his mouth a hard line that might have been chiseled by the same mason who'd given the iron statues their scowls. "You should have worn the crown," Jon said softly as they crossed into the long, shadowed hall where braziers burned with smokeless coal and white pennants hung like frost. "I've a head for drink and a head for a helm," Robert said. "I've no head for a crown this morning. Let them see that I am a man come to do business, not to prance." He rolled his shoulder where a patch had been sewn on his cloak and grinned at Jon, that loose, unlordly grin that had charmed half the young men of the Stormlands into following him to war. "Besides," he added, "I would not have it fall into the canal." Stannis made a low sound. "It will not be a jest to them. I have never yet met a man I could not make laugh," Robert said. "Then you have not often met Braavosi bankers," Jon murmured. "Let me speak first." They came to the Chamber of Keys. 24 locks rimmed the high bronze doors, each the size of a man's head. At their center, a wheel of interlocked iron held a cold, glassy eye. 12 masked servants in black and purple livery turned the wheel with long poles, a ritual of movement as precise as the dance of a dozen swords. The doors opened with a sigh like an old man drawing breath, and inside, winter light fell from a ceiling set with panes of milk glass, each holding its tarnish like a memory. Tables of ebon would stood in long ranks, quills set in stands shaped like tiny Titan spears, sandpots ready. Men in sober robes sat with hands folded. At the far end of the chamber, upon a dais no higher than a step, 5 chairs waited. Only one was occupied. "Your Grace," said the man in the chair, rising. Gray hair swept back from his brow as if the tide had combed it. His face held the slow severity of a man raised to sums and seasons. "I am Palio Marhis, first among the keyholders today." "First among equals," Robert said. He stopped halfway up the hall and threw his cloak wide. "I am Robert of House Baratheon, by the grace of gods and swords, king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, lord of the 7 kingdoms and protector of—" "No, that is enough. You know me. I have come to speak of debt." Palio's mouth bent the smallest degree. "So has every king ever born." "I have not come to beg," Robert said. "I have come to bargain." Jon arrived at Robert's side. "We have set our understanding in parchment," he said, and passed a roll tied in blue. "We seek to refinance crown obligations at terms that are good for the realm and acceptable to the bank." Palio turned the parchment once, as if its weight could be weighed by the hand. He gave it to a clerk, and the clerk carried it to a long table whose surface bore the marks of 1,000 calculations and stood with it in a pool of light. Quills lifted, sand hissed, and a dozen men began to read, each the shadow of the others. Stannis stood as if he had sworn to keep still. "Your Grace will permit me," Palio said, "to note that the bank is not a tavern and Braavos is not a whore. We do not sell our service for the flatteries of princes." Robert laughed softly. It startled the nearest scribes. "I flatter no man, banker." "No," Jon said, "but I will flatter the truth. We have ended a war that might have bled these kingdoms white for a generation. Peace is profit for all. Peace without the weight of a single family's purse upon the throne is better profit. We will not be beholden to Casterly Rock." There was a thin stir in the benches. They had expected it, of course, but expectation and hearing are different wines. Palio's hands lay flat on the polished arms of his chair. "The throne has long received Lannister gold," Palio said. "It may receive it as taxes," Stannis answered, "and not as patronage." The Bravosi raised his eyes to Stannis. "You are the brother who held Storm's End against half the world?" "I am the brother who held Storm's End against hunger," Stannis said. No pride touched the blunt reply. "You know a siege when you see one," Palio said. "I see one always," Stannis said. "The crown is besieged by overpromised coin. We have port dues, turnpikes, licenses upon wine and exotic spices that come through King's Landing and Gulltown and White Harbor, mint rights and fishing rights, fines and forfeitures. And a king," Palio said. "A particular expenditure." Robert smiled without much humor. "Say it, man. I drink too much and I spend too much. I have a great fondness for tourneys. I am lord and leal friend to half my realm. You will make your coin upon me if you hold me to your terms. But I will not belong to Tywin Lannister. The crown will not rise from a western bed, nor lie down upon an eastern loan without a blanket," Palio said. His eyes shifted, almost idly. From the side door came a thin man carrying a cedar case. Behind him, a younger man with a narrow face and a neat beard like ink-drawn lines. The younger man set 3 ledgers down with a care that spoke of the weight their numbers carried. He nodded to Palio. "This is Tycho Nestoris," Palio said. "A clerk now, to be more later. He will review your schedules of revenue, your grace, and the contemplation of collateral. We propose a 10-year term. We will, in turn, close certain lines of Lannister support to the City Watch and the Keeper of the Keys. We do not war with gold, but we will not be the purse of your enemies." "The crown has no enemies," Jon said. "Only subjects." The Bravosi did not bother to hide his skepticism. Tycho opened the first ledger and dipped his quill. The faint scratch of a dozen pens began. Robert looked at the bowed heads and at the light in the milk glass and at his own knuckles, scarred and capable. He said nothing. Overhead, the fog bled its dimness into the chamber until the braziers were gilding men's faces from beneath, making the keyholders look like masks upon sticks. "When ply and counterply are measured," Palio said at last, "we will show you our figure. We will require a receiver for the port of King's Landing to ensure the discipline your grace has not always found compatible with his nature. You will not name this receiver. We will." Robert opened his mouth. Jon's hand, gentle as a father's in a child's hair, touched his forearm. "Who?" "He will be called auditor to the coin," Palio said. "Not above your master of coin, but beside him. He will sit as an observer on your small council. He will not give counsel. You will borrow our coin and not our tongue," Stannis said. "I prefer that. And we will bind your coin to our ledger in ways you cannot break without breaking your oaths," Palio said. "This is Bravos." Robert shut his mouth with a click of teeth. He might have roared. He might have turned upon his heel and thrown the whole enterprise into the canal. But he had not come across the narrow sea to roar. He had come because he had lived long enough to know that sitting a throne meant feeling the bruise of restraint as well as the rush of the chase. "You will get your due," he said at last, "and the crown will not beg of the rock." "The bank does not fear a lack of due," Palio said mildly. "It is the other parties who will learn to fear it." He lifted his hand. Tycho's quill stilled. It was, in the event, the easiest part of the matter. Terms were hammered out until the fog burned off and returned and darkened again, until Robert's temper grew bones and went quiet, until Jon's patience wore to threads and was rewoven by the habit of duty, until Stannis's contempt cooled into something like a bare respect for numbers that did not lie. Collateral attached to port dues and the mint's production, to excise on dyes and tar, and an incremental levy upon the sale of swords in King's Landing itself. A clause, a short, dull line, confirmed continuity of obligation upon the succession of the lawful heir recognized by the High Septon's anointing and witnesses and, failing that, by the laws of male descent set down in the Great Council of a century past. John read that line twice and felt the hair at his nape stir. Stannis read it once and nodded, unsurprised. Robert did not read it at all. When they returned to the quay, the bells had ceased, and the damp wore a sharper edge. Robert climbed into the boat and sat with his broad hands on his knees. "John," he said. "The wedding." John's eyes went to the water. "We should speak of it, yes?" Stannis said nothing. He watched the oars bite, and his face gave no window. "I will not give Lannister Gold the keys to the Treasury," Robert said. "That is done. That is dead." He spat into the canal. The little star of it vanished in a heartbeat. "But the marriage is not coin. It is peace." "It is both," Stannis said. "It is a rope to bind lion and stag," John said softly. "The realm is weary of cutting." Robert looked at his hands. For a moment the laughter went out of him utterly. "Then bind me," he said. "But you tell the lion he will not carry my purse. Tell him that with your pretty words, John, if he does not like my ugly ones." The bells began to ring again. Different bells now, a lower tenor that jostled the air as the oarsmen bent to their labor. Above the rooftops the Titan's shadow cut the fog like a blade. The raven that flew westward carried more letters than one. It carried the new charter for the receiver of the port of King's Landing, a gentleman of Bravos named Lornero Fass, who wore sober grays and had a habit of counting his breaths between statements. It carried the debt schedules and the little clause that would later matter more than any of them guessed. It carried a polite letter for Lord Tywin Lannister advising him that his dear-bought daughter would be queen, and his gold would not be the crown's backbone, however strong his vaults. It carried meant courtesies for the High Septon. It carried notes to the masters of coin and ships and laws, and to Varys, who needed no letters to know what he knew but liked to have them nonetheless. King's Landing received the Raven as it received all things, with noise. Carts creaked, hawkers cried, gulls snatched, and Mistress Manda's girls laughed in the Alley of Silk, elbows to the shutters, necks bare to the winter sun. The Red Keep's courtyards blazed with banners. The small council chamber smelled of warmed wine. The Master of Coin was a young enough man still that his beard did not quite know itself. He called himself Peter Baelish and called the king Your Grace, with a softness that set on his tongue like cream. He took the letters as if they were lovers and tucked them near his heart and smiled at Jon Arryn with eyes that did not look where they pointed. An auditor from Bravos began to attend the council. He sat with his ledger open and his quill ready and wrote down everything he heard and nothing he said. The gold cloaks were paid regular as the tide. The King's Landing mint cut dies for stags and dragons and had the iron of Bravos in its accounts. The Lannister steward at court, an unprepossessing man with yellow eyebrows and a talent for hearing doors, sent 3 letters to Casterly Rock and received 1 reply, short enough to ride in a ring. Lord Tywin's letter to the king was no warmer than the winter sun. It was not colder than iron. It congratulated the king and queen. It consented to the terms. It named injustice a rumor, the talk of lesser men. It observed that a lion cannot tell his claws from his paws. In its last line there lived a courtesy like a drawn, immaculate blade. Cersei and Robert wed beneath the vaults of the great September, and the glass crystals shed 1,000 rainbows upon her hair. She was uncommonly beautiful and knew it. She walked like a queen and watched like a hawk. She kissed the king when it was the time for kissing, and did not wince when he tasted of wine rather than dew. She smiled at the ladies who would be her ladies, and she did not look at Stannis at all, nor at Jon Arryn except once when he turned his head and caught an instant of appraisal, as if he were a gaunt hound whose teeth she wished to count. She smiled at the Master of Coin and at the Master of Whispers, and if her smile held any place where cold slept it was so small that most men did not perceive it. At the feast Robert laughed until the rafters shook. Jugglers juggled, mummers mimed. A singer with a voice like gold told of a girl who leapt from a tower rather than be caged in a castle far from home. Only Varys saw Jon Arryn's eyes at that moment and how the old man looked not at the singer but at the king's face, shadowed now by candlelight, and knew that a wound has memory like a wolf has scent. In the weeks that followed the marriage, ships moved differently. Tall ships with Bravosi flags docked at King's Landing with bales of wool dyed so fine it darkened clear to purple, jars of Ibn sealskin oil, iron from the Cahoric forges, spices whose names the stevedores mispronounced and loved to mispronounce. From Lannisport came less. Not nothing, Lannister pride could afford no boycotts that looked like sulking, but less. Peter Baelish smoothed it with numbers that looked like patience. "It is the winter draft," he said to the Bravosi auditor, the gray-dressed Lornero Fass, and his smile had edges only when the other man looked away. "The West ships choose other ports when winds favor." Lornero did not argue, he wrote. Jon Arryn received reports the way a man receives prayer, with the habit of faith and a knowledge that not all prayers are answered the way the prayers intend. He wrote letters to lords who thought he liked letters too much and to those who did not care for letters at all. He arranged the dowries of girls whose mothers could not bear to say the word duty. He sent the king to bed when the king would have drunk a fourth flagon. He sat beneath the painted table of the small council chamber while Stannis glowered and Renly smiled and Varys oiled everything he touched. "What I cannot abide," Stannis said, "is that the Lannisters look upon the Treasury and see only a door that did not open to their hand." "They will try another," Renly said, bright as a coin. "They will charm the king and show him what gold may buy when it sits upon a woman's hair. They will make him laugh in the right rooms and promise him horses with legs as long as ladders and hunts in the Kingswood that run as if straight from a singer's tail. They will attempt to influence the city watch," Varys murmured, and watched Jon Arryn's eyes. "They will cultivate friends among captains. They will notice every man who fears to lose his pay and every man whose children need bread more than they need honor. And then, perhaps, they will choose that boy to remember their names when the accounting is made." "Not if the bank pays them," Stannis said. Varys smiled, almost with pity. Honor and hunger do not always stand upon opposite sides of the quay. In the end, it wasn't coin that began to change things. It was stubbornness. It was the knowledge behind Cersei's eyes that the crown had been cut free of a chain her father had forged, and her pride's inability to reconcile that knowledge with the tiara upon her hair. She went to the small council once, only once. She listened from a cushioned chair while the auditor from Bravos described in the careful tone of a man who lived within numbers the pattern of incoming tariffs for the quarter. She did not truly hear him. What she heard was that he spoke, and that Pycelle, who had the beard of a learned man and the mind of a timid one, listened like a supplicant to a prayer in a foreign tongue. She looked at Peter Baelish, and he sat with his hands neatly folded, his countenance all charm, and said, "The king must not be inconvenienced by the bank's need to collect. Perhaps we might advance the watch a quarter's pay, that they feel how generous the crown can be when its servants attend to their duties. It costs little to purchase good feeling." "The watch will be paid," Lornero Fass said. He did not look at Baelish. He did not look at the queen. He wrote something in his ledger instead. She left before the meeting ended and walked the gallery alone. In a place where the stones met under an arch, she stopped and pressed both hands against the wall and tried to count her breaths. But numbers did not still her. She thought of Lannisport's bright harbor, of towers that smelled of salt and cedar, of her father's eyes when he told her she would be queen, how there had been a weight in his voice like a door bolting home. She had thought herself placed in a throne room alone with a pliant man. Instead, she found herself placed in a nest of men who thought their little sums were a law independent of her crown. Pride is a hab. It as much as a feeling. She took it down from the peg on which she had always hung it and put it on again. Sometime after spring, Jon Arryn fell ill. He suffered no wound you could point to and say, "This." It came like a chill one cannot shake, a weight in the stomach that turned food to ash, a haze over the light of the day. One night the white ravens had flown to announce summer at last. The next day Jon could not keep down his breakfast. Pycelle clucked and prescribed things that smelled of mint and relief. Lisa Arryn wept into handkerchiefs that never dried. Somewhere a woman whose name the servants did not know smirked over a tower's cup. Peter Baelish wrote a letter to a lady in the Vale and then threw it into the fire and smiled at his reflection in the smoke. The king came to Jon Arryn's chamber once, late, smelling of horse and meat. He stood by the bed that housed Jon's thinning strength and did not know what to do with his hands. "Old friend," Robert said. "Be easy." Jon tried to smile, and to his surprise he somewhat succeeded. "You never could take care of yourself," he said. "Came out not quite right." Robert's laughter started and stopped, like a man who sees a pit in the road. "We will ride when you are up again. I will show you a place in the Kingswood where the deer are so tall the trees bend to them." "Stags boasting," Jon said. He closed his eyes and opened them, the lids heavier than once they had been. "Listen to me, Robert." He had thought to speak of a dozen matters. He discovered that words had weight and could not all fit in his mouth at once. "Write the matter of your heir, in plain letters, with witnesses." He swallowed. "And listen to Stannis." Robert rocked back as if a blow had landed. "You want me to put my name to parchment this minute?" "Yes," Jon said. He had used that voice on young men who did not wish to go where duty required. It still worked on kings. "You must write that your lawful heir shall succeed, and that the obligations of the crown continue. You must put your seal to it with witnesses." Pycelle nodded from the hearth. His eyes were soft as dough. "It is wise, your grace," he said. "Not," he groped, found the word, almost smiled. "Not unprecedented. Kings do such things. A will of regency, a confirmation of succession." Stannis came that same night at Jon's summons. He stood beside the bed like a dark tree. "It is done," Stannis said when Pycelle had tottered off to snore over his leeches. "The king must sign. The banksman will witness. The High Septon will send his own." "Forgive me," Jon said, "if I do not rise and dance." Stannis's mouth moved in what might have been an attempt to be kind and settled for an acknowledgement. "You have done your duty, Lord Arryn." "I meant to do more," Jon said and slept. Robert was in his cups by the time Pycelle found him, and then it was morning, and by morning there was a hunt to plan, and then there were hounds baying and the king's roads dust in his teeth. He signed, though, with a flourish that blotched the parchment. He signed because it was easier to sign than to argue with a dying man, and because Stannis's eyes contained a grave in which any nonsense would be buried without a marker, and because Lornero Fast stood with his ledger open and his quill set, and it seemed that writing a name cost less than not writing one. The hunt was loud, as his hunts always were. He drank from a skin that Renly had switched with water before the noon hour and back again afterward when no one was looking. He laughed at a sow that charged, at a boy who lost his hat to a branch, at a song about a miller's wife and a goose. He wrestled the boar at the end with a spear that War had chosen and tore his thigh as he did so, but not badly. When they came home, his leg was bound and he scowled at the bandage and kissed the queen in the throne room while the court cheered. He did not die of a hunt. He died of a fever 5 weeks later that no one could point at and say this, and in his death he was like Jon Arryn. Cersei stood by the bed as he sweated and muttered, and something like pity found a narrow entry into her heart when he said a certain name, and she pushed it out again because her heart was not a house for such things. Stannis came and did not say anything. He stood like an iron post at the foot of the bed. Renly paced until he could not bear the heat. Pycelle fussed. Varys drifted like silk. Peter Baelish arrived just late enough to look as if he had nearly not arrived in time and sighed like a harp string. The parchment that Robert had signed with a bloody flourish lay in a cedar box with a key at its neck. It had the seal of the crown and the counterseal of the High Septon, whose fat fingers had found devotion surprisingly quick when presented with a donation for the orphans and a mention of continuity of alms upon lawful succession. The Braavosi auditor had witnessed as a matter of form and then, at Stannis's quiet insistence, had dispatched a copy by fast galley to Braavos. He had not known why that would matter. He had known only that his instructions were to record everything, no matter how large or small, that might affect the bank's accounts. He had watched kings rise and fall on parchment more than on spears. When the king died, the bells rang all day and all night. The queen kept her face like a cold mask. The city drank half its cellars dry and devoted the other half to rumor. Janos Slynt counted his men twice. Varys walked his soft-soled shoes along the places where the Red Keep's shadows are longest and touched the stones the way a man might touch the arm of an old lover whose moods he had learned too well. On the morning after the bells ceased, Eddard Stark arrived from the Tower of the Hand with the cedar box. His face was winter. He met Cersei in the small council chamber and looked at her as if she were a page he could not read quickly. "My lady," he said, "your GR. Ace," she said, and let her voice show a little brightness of insult that he had not spoken the title. He set the cedar box on the table. "The king named his lawful heir," he said. "His will bears the High Septon's counterseal, the bank's witness." He did not look at Lannister. He did not need to. Cersei did not glance at the box. "My son is king," she said, and the pride in her voice was not a decorous ornament but a blade. "He is crowned in his father's blood, whether or not you made some old man draw lines upon a page to soothe your own humor." "No," Eddard Stark said. There was no anger in it. "The law is plain. Joffrey is his mother's son. Jaime Lannister was not at her shoulder. He was in the yard breaking a lance's head on a Quinton with more ferocity than sense, and afterward he broke the lance across his knee and called for another." Cersei felt for him as one feels for an object one wishes to throw, with a fury that has its own cold logic. Instead she looked at the faces around her. Varys, unreadable. Renly, a line between his brows, not of grief. Peter, hands neat, smile ready to be summoned. Pycelle, soft. Stannis's gaze was like the nail in a thief's ear. He had the parchment. He had the law. He had, perhaps, 1,000 fewer friends than any man in the room. "You will not," Cersei said to Eddard Stark, "put a parchment above a king." "I will put the law above all men," Stannis said before Ned could speak, and even Varys blinked at the sound of his voice in that chamber. "The High Septon's hand is upon that law as witness to the crown's own seal. It is not a question of liking words. It is a question of binding oaths. The Watch will keep order in the city. The king's hand," and for an instant, a tiny and almost human twist of grief touched that last word. "The king's hand will present the will before the court and the High Septon this afternoon. The lawful heir will be proclaimed." "You are quick," Peter Baelish said, almost as if complimenting. "I have had years to think and wait," Stannis said. "And because the bank will withdraw its credit upon any attempt to usurp the line, and its receiver sits upon your council and will see every coin that passes out of the purse." Cersei's head turned, not much, enough that she saw the Braavosi clerk in the corner. The gray one, the little one, the one who wrote and never spoke. He did not return her look. He sat with his neat quill and his neat ledger and his little pot of sand and watched as if watching a market stall sell apples some men would die for. "Gold cloaks," she said to Janos Slynt. She did not raise her voice. It had steel enough without volume. "You will seize the hand." She meant to say more. She meant to move the room like a horseshoe moves. She did not. Janos Slynt's mouth opened and shut. He looked at Peter Baelish as if the man were a mirror that could tell him what face to put on. Peter's smile was warm as a hearth. "The watch is paid from the Treasury," Peter murmured, "and the Treasury is held very carefully at the moment. We have, as the bank might say," he half bowed to the Braavosi, "our obligations." Janos Slynt's eyes flicked toward Lannister. The Braavosi did not look back. He turned a page and wrote a date. He wrote a word that meant, "The king is dead," in a hand that never wavered. He sanded the ink. "You have bought the watch," Cersei said. She looked at Peter as if she had never seen him, as if he had just taken off a mask and put on another. "You and your Eastern lackey." Peter's smile did not move. Varys smoothed a sleeve. Pycelle wheezed. Renly looked at the door in a way that said, "I will not be present for the next scene." Stannis did not move. Eddard Stark reached and opened the cedar box and took out the will. He set it upon the table and broke the seal and read. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. It is in such moments later that men say it was inevitable. It never is. A single captain of the watch choosing to take an offer he does not entirely understand. A small man in gray deciding that he will send a copy to Braavos not in the afternoon but at dawn. A king who laughs. A brother who does not. These are the tiny arrows in a volley that looks like a wall. But when the High Septon raised his hand that afternoon and intoned in a voice like bees humming in a hive that the obligations of the crown continued under the lawful heir, and when Eddard Stark read out the will in the great hall and men shifted their feet uneasily, and when Stannis Baratheon stepped forward not with grandeur but with gravity, and when, at that same moment, a clerk in a Braavosi counting house in King's Landing made a mark that froze certain lines of coin that had been meant to warm Lannister hands, and when the watch ringed the great hall not with swords drawn but with their grips loosened, ready, and when Barristan Selmy put his hand to the hilt not of the sword he loved but to the truth that lived in his marrow, then the thing men would later call inevitability came to pass. Cersei laughed. It sounded like glass. "Arrest her," Stannis said. The word fell flat as iron. Janos Slynt lifted his hand and then lowered it. "Your Grace," he said to Cersei. He said it quietly, and for the first time in his life he meant it as a plea. "Do not resist." "For what?" She turned to the men in white. "For what? For being queen? For bearing children? Will you draw swords on a mother?" Barristan Selmy's eyes closed a heartbeat. When he opened them again, the clarity in them could have cut paper. "For the king's peace," he said, and when he reached for her elbow his hand was as soft as a prayer. "My lady." Jaime did not come through the doors with blades and laughter and sin in his eyes. He stood in the yard, breathing like a bull, and a squire ran to tell him, and he threw the splintered lance aside and came quickly and did not get there in time to break the world. They put Cersei in a room with windows that looked upon the bay. She was not in chains. She arranged her hair before the mirror that evening and looked at herself without pretending she was anyone else. She thought of her father's letter, patient and immaculate, and for the first time in years she wished that she had gone home after the wedding and never returned. She folded that wish into a corner of herself and locked it. News ran to the rock like wind. Tywin Lannister received it in his solar with a stillness that would have made a lesser man shout. He read the courier's letter, which came from his steward in the capital and bore more truth for being shorter than courtesy would prefer. He asked a single question. He received the answer he had already known. He dismissed the steward with no more expression than he had shown the letter. Kevin Lannister said, "We march." Tywin's eyes moved to the map. "We spend," he said, "and then we march." They did both. Gold went out to men whose tongues had no particular loyalty. Coin ran along roads into the hands of lesser captains of the watch. But the watch's payroll did not falter. The flows were cleaned by a Braavosi clerk who did not make speeches, only marks. Ships left Lannisport with cargoes of wool and copper that found fewer buyers in King's Landing than they had found in a decade. Smugglers on the coast prospered for a moment and then began to vanish. The port's receiver did not call it war. He called it an interruption in regular trade, and he smiled when he said it as a man might smile at a mother's first labor pains. When the Lannister host struck into the Riverlands in a swift, punishing raid meant to test the realm's nerve and find the old seams, they met more men than they had expected and fewer frightened ones. It was no kindly affair. The Great John licked his chops and cut a man from saddle to saddle. Hoster Tully came out in a litter to bless his banners. Eddard Stark rode south with a small, hard knot of Northmen and a purpose in his eyes that made men move aside. Stannis took the fleet west, and Davos Seaworth, dour and competent and not much loved by any but his king, watched his captain's eyes like a man watches the weather. "We are not them," Davos said to a younger master who liked to talk of iron-born ways. "We are in the king's service. We burn only what the king says. We take no salt wives. We account for every bolt of cloth. We put every last coin where the Braavosi says to put it." The young man laughed and stopped at the look on Stannis's face. Lannisport had not had reason to fear a royal fleet in living memory. It had feared Ironborn, and it had once feared dragons. Stannis's ships came like a tide that knows precisely how far the shore lies and what rocks in it could bruise its feet. They did not burn the harbor. That would have served no one, least of all a crown whose revenues were tied to ports. They seized vessels. They cut anchor lines. They planted chain across the harbor mouth and fixed it at shore with simple engines. They did not assail the rock. Stannis had looked at the red slopes rising like a god's fist above the harbor and known the waste of it. Jaime Lannister broke 3 swords on that campaign and 2 oaths. He left Lannisport to strike the Tullus, found himself boxed by Northmen who rode and fought like men who understood the difference between valor and vanity, and was taken in a narrow stretch between a hedgerow and a mill by men who did not much care that he was the Kingslayer when their Lord Commander had told them to bring him in alive. The blow that unhorsed him was not elegant. It was effective. Not a bard lived to sing about the moment. The one who tried wrote a song that got him laughed out of a marketplace in Fairmarket, and he took up baking in a village that the passing soldiers missed. When the news of Jaime's capture ran like a blade through the west, Tywin did not so much as lift his hand. He read the courier's letter, said a word to the honey that he was stirring into hot wine. It tasted no different afterward, and then he went to the window and stood. He did not slam his fist. He did not curse his son. He thought of 1,000 pieces upon 1,000 boards, and which were his to move and which had been moved for him. In King's Landing, Cersei heard and did not break. She went to the window of her not-quite prison, the one that looked on the bay, and watched the gray water and thought of the boy she had made a king in her mind and the boy he was in his bones. Joffrey had been taken from his chambers in the Red Keep and sent to a place where he would see less and be seen less. He howled and kicked and called for her and for his father and for swords. The hand stood like a dark tower and did not revoke the order. Barristan Selmy did not look at the boy, and if he did not look, it was because the thing he would see would hurt him in a place that had few nerve endings left. Myrcella went to Dorne because Eddard Stark counted old alliances like a man counts grain in a famine, and Tommen learned to make his bed in rooms that were not his own. So, Peter Baelish said to Varys one evening when the sky over Blackwater Bay had turned the color of old bruises and the gulls had fallen silent as knives. The bank paid the captains, the watch did not sell, the lion finds his paw caught. You are very good at telling me that this was inevitable. Varys, who had come to stand upon the tower for a breath of air that did not smell like burning wick, smiled. No, nothing is inevitable, but the bank does not play at chance when it sets a game upon the table. You see that now. Peter's hands folded. He had placed himself in this. He had thought to ride the bank's discipline as a courser rides a light horse, touching his boot, lifting or lowering his weight, making the creature seem his own with a whisper and a gesture. He had found instead that you do not ride iron. You hitch yourself to it and let it pull. It had pulled him to an outcome that was not exactly the one he would have painted, but he saw in it the shape of opportunity. A realm less fractured than chaos did not promise him all he craved, but it promised pathways along which a nimble man might dance. Stannis is ascetic, he said. He will clear the treasuries of Sup. He will require tithe from men who do not think of themselves as tithe. He will count. Counting is a kind of power you do not try often enough, Varys suggested gently. Peter's smile was a knife left near a child. The counting I do is invisible, he said. It did not end at Lannisport. That would be tidy, and the world loves untidy endings. Tywin withdrew. He did not retreat, not that proud word, but he redrew. His host pulled into the west. He sent ravens that pledged vengeance and others that offered hostages and still others that simply asked for time. Time is a coin the poor spend quickly and the rich hoard to buy houses. He bought breathing room. He bought sellswords whose names were not the kinds of names bards sing. He bought the faith of a certain number of lesser lordlings in the Reach by paying debts they did not care to confess. He did not, for all his might, stop the leak of coin that the bank had opened. He could not teach captains that a coin promised tomorrow would fill a belly today. The trial came. It had to. To leave Cersei in a room, untried, unanswered, would begin to rot the court from beneath. The High Septon, an old man who liked sweetmeats and had learned to like power late, balked and then couched his balking in theology, and then agreed when Stannis, in a voice like southern granite, said, "The law is not your private purse." She stood in the hall and did not bow her head. She could not deny, not in truth, not with any hope of the outcome that would matter to her, that her children were begotten of a man not the king. She could deny it to those who needed to save themselves by pretending. She did not waste the breath. "You have stolen the crown," she told Stannis, "and now you will steal my life. You are an ungenerous thief." Stannis looked at her as one looks at a cliff one will not move by wishing. "No," he said, "I will not steal it. I will take it by law." "Do not dress murder in robes," Cersei said. and when she turned her head, her eyes found Eddard Stark. "What of your mercy? It is not mine to give," he said. She laughed then, the same laugh as the day in the hall, hard and bright. "You call yourselves men," she said, and then her voice did the smallest thing, which was not to tremble exactly, but to regard the place where it would have. "Kill me and see what you make of our boy." "You have made of him what he is," Eddard said, "and I will not kill you." He looked at Stannis then, and for the first time in all his long acquaintance with that man he said a thing to him in public he had not said in private, and it was a kind of plea. "She is the daughter of Tywin Lannister. He will fight until the last stone in his house falls if he believes you will kill his blood. Give him a reason to relent. Send her to the Silent Sisters. Put her in a god's house. Make her take the veil." Stannis's face moved as little as rock moves. Something in his jaw ticked. He looked at the Braavosi clerk standing at the side of the hall. The clerk did not return his look. He looked at the High Septon, whose eyes were calculating how many prayers he would need to say. He looked at the men in the hall who had fought and bled and prayed. "Very well," he said, came out like a sigh struck through with iron. "The law permits life indentured to the gods in lieu of execution when treason touches blood royal and complicity cannot be proven beyond a doubt. She will take the veil. She will not speak. She will not see." Cersei held her head as if it were made of ruby. "You will not have my hair," she said low. "It is all the crown your line ever deserved." They shaved it the next morning anyway. When the Raven told Tywin Lannister that his daughter breathed but wore the veil, he did break something. It was small and valuable. Its pieces fell neatly. When he spoke, he said, "So, and then, we will take our coin out of the banks that owe the crown. We will make all our business private." He sent men to collect certain debts with words and others with knives. It worked until it did not. The Iron Bank does not cut throats, but it will stop the throats it feeds. Lannisport learned what it is to be an island in a sea that knows your name. In the north, winter spoke in voices less political. Snow came early to the Wolf's Wood. Robb Stark rode in furs and learned patience that would sit on him for a lifetime. He watched his father return from the south with all his limbs and fewer illusions, and when Eddard told him of duty, he believed the man and not merely the words. Sansa's eyes lost some of their shine, but they widened at the idea of Dorne, where her sister would go to take the warmth the north would not give her. Arya learned to be quiet under will, which is a harder skill than learning to shout under anger. Bran climbed less and read more. The Night's Watch sent ravens asking for coin and men and, slightly more often now, for boots and salt beef. The Braavosi clerk, having perfected the habit of writing what matters, wrote one day that the Night's Watch's accounts showed such hunger that sending them more would marshal goodwill in the north and be cheap in the south. In the margin he wrote, "The bank may also extend small credit in goods to the wall, as unrest is bad for all markets." The Iron Bank, which had once backed a slave city's war because tallies showed profit, found that backing an ice wall of men offered less profit and more prudence. It was a new calculation, and it only came because a clerk had once written down a will the way he had written down a ship's manifest and a measure of cloves. Across the narrow sea, a girl with silver hair traded old RDS for new names and walked among tents that smelled of horse sweat and hot milk, and did not know that in a court far away a king had been made without putting her house back on its throne. She learned to ride forward. She learned not to look back. She learned that some fires require more breath than men possess. When her fires came, they would be her own, not lit by the quiet abacus of a bank across a sea. Time passed. Stannis ruled. It was not a joyous reign. He held to law like a drowning man to a rope and did not much care who found the rope course. He put men in places they had earned and not in places that felt comfortable. He made Pycelle retire and replaced him with a maester who did not wheeze when he told him unpleasant facts. He kept Peter Baelish at coin because moving him would cost more than watching him. The Braavosi auditor sat and wrote and sometimes, infrequently and carefully, spoke. "The king's ships," he would say, "require new planking. The forest rights will bear this if cut in winter, not autumn. Or, if levy upon vigils at the Great September is increased by a fraction, the High Septon will protest. but his protests will cost him less than a true quarrel, and he will accept. Stannis listened not because he liked the clerk, but because the clerk was right more often than not and never made friends of his truths. He did a thing no king had done in a long time. He stood in the yard of the Red Keep on a certain morning, when the air held iron like a boy holds a secret, and he watched a line of men be paid, each his coin, each marked on a list that someone checked thrice. He said nothing. He watched. The men left with coin in their hands and a look in the eyes that was not love but was not fear. It was, if such things have names, a recognition. It is no slight thing to be recognized by the man to whom one has sworn. Barristan Selmy saw it and closed his eyes and thought that perhaps, in the end, vows meant they were seen and not just bound. War did not vanish. It never does. The Lannisters did not know how to lose and did not lose as much as men like to say. But they did learn that there is a way to be contained that is more constricting than a manacle and softer than a collar. To live with your trade reduced, your ships checked, your sons constrained, your pride called to account by numbers you cannot change with a sword. Some men go mad in such bindings and lash out. Tywin did not lash out. He endured, and he trained his men to endure. He looked for new seams. He found some. Others he did not. Cersei took the veil and discovered that silence is a world. She had never been forced to live within it. At first it was a scream. Then it was a sea. She learned to fold linen without creasing it. She learned the names of the girls who hid broken places under their eyes and fed them honey. She learned to hold her tongue when the High Septon's servant replaced the bowl of an old woman who ate too little. She learned to stand at a window and look at the bay through a screen and know that ships went and came like thoughts you cannot bring back once they leave. She grew her hair by inches that felt like insults measured out by hand. Sometimes she dreamed of a hall and men in it who would not be moved by her voice. In her dreams, her father came to her with his hands behind his back and did not speak either. She woke with her mouth aching with unsaid words. Eddard Stark went home. He left King's Landing after 3 years that felt like 3 winters. He left with his honor mostly whole and his wife's hand warm in his as they rode north. He left a boy on the throne who thinned into a man with lines where lines should be on a decent, hard face. He left a city whose gutters stank less because the coin had filled fewer bellies with sour wine and more with bread. He left with a letter in his saddlebag from a clerk in Bravos addressed to the Castellan of White Harbor, proposing a manner of shipment that would enrich both and, not incidentally, ensure timely deliveries to the garrison upon the wall. He laughed when he read it and shook his head and said to Catelyn, "We will be ruled by ledgers. We have been ruled by worse," she said. He left with a thought he did not say aloud. That law, like winter, is not loved but respected, and it keeps men indoors when storms might scatter them. The storms came. They always do. Greyjoys remembered that ships are a kind of religion with the salt for its sacrament and struck where ships are not watched for. Stannis watched. It bled him. Men do not love the man who takes their feast to pay for their shovel, but they do dig a trench when he tells them. Davos sailed at night under stars that did not choose sides and came home with 3 fewer fingers and the same number of truths. He told Stannis, "We can be both miser and necessary," and Stannis said, "I know." The bank did not smile. Banks do not. But it continued to have its due, and when it did not, it removed its due from hiding places that men thought were clever. Men cursed Bravos in their cups. Others blessed it when the city watch came for wages like saints in plain face. Time can make of even unusual arrangements a habit. The auditor's place on the small council grew to be a chair no man remarked. Peter Baelish fattened and then thinned and then coiled again like a wire. Varys shaved each morning and sometimes, while the razor scraped across his head, thought of a boy across the sea being taught that a crown is a hat that sits upon the skull and the spine both. Renly smiled until he found no more smiles in the rooms he walked and went south to the Reach to learn how a garden uses fences. Stannis failed to laugh and learned to be endured. The hand of the king sat in Winterfell and operated a realm from afar with ravens and stern letters. It seemed impossible, and then it was simply the way of things. He sent sons to watch and daughters to wed and men to work. He stood in a god's wood one. morning when the frost on the branches glittered like a reminder that beauty can be cold, and thanked the old gods that he had not left his bones in the mud of a southern street. When the snows deepened and men began to remember that tales of things that do not speak should be heeded, the night's watch found barrels of oats and salted beef and boots in the steward's house that had not been there the winter before. They bore the crest of no house. They bore, discreetly, the stamp of a key. Men cursed and were grateful and did not speak about either in company, because habits formed in the south begin to falter in the north and vice versa. It happened that a party of rangers found not one dead thing that should not walk but a dozen. It happened that they lost 4 men and a measure of belief in the neatness of the world. It happened that one of them, a man with no reputation and a deep laugh, came home and told the commander that the stories told by men who drink themselves to sleep are true enough when you bite them. The commander wrote a letter. The letter went south with a seal of black wax. It was added to a stack of letters that, in another world, might have sat unopened in a tower until a raven's bones turned to dust. Stannis Baratheon read it at a desk whose wood he had paid for with coin he had argued about. He read it with his jaw set. He wrote 3 orders. 1 sent 1,000 barrels north by road. 1 sent 50 men who were not the least of their kind. 1 sent the audit clerk from Braavos to White Harbor to meet with Lord Manderley and arrange shipments through winter that would keep both men's accounts. He did not smile. He did not pray. He did not pound the desk. He made the shapes that keep men alive with little phrases and simple marks. Lornero Fass, who had never seen the wall and would never see it, who would die in his bed after a long life of ledgers and numbers that behaved and numbers that did not, wrote 3 lines in his book about the transactions. The last of them read, in the crabbed hand he had always had, "The bank has no friend but balance." He sanded the line. He went to his window and looked out over the bay. It would have been more exciting, perhaps, for bards and boys, if the city had burned again and dragons flown down and men in antlered helms had ridden through blood to their eyes. There would be such days. They always come. But there were this handful of years when a man's signature mattered more than his sword. When the lion found his claws blunted not by siege but by silence where Coin had once shouted. When a queen learned to be quiet and survived it and came to understand that survival is itself a power, though not the kind she craved. When a king who never learned to be loved was obeyed, and that was enough. When a northern lord returned home to teach his children that law is a kind of mercy because it requires the same thing of everyone. When winter finally bent low over the world and breathed, men drew their cloaks around them and went on. The braziers in the counting houses burned lower to save coal. The watchmen stamped their feet harder on the battlements. The Iron Bank balanced the line where the crown's obligations ran into the wall's needs and once only, wrote upon its page in a smaller hand than usual a word that otherwise appeared in none of its books. Necessity. On a night when the wind came down like a blunt knife, a girl in the Vale looked west with a yearning she did not yet know how to name. In a city in the Reach, a lord's son counted his friends and found the number wanting and did not know that in a different life the counting would be worse. In the Frostfangs, a boy who had never seen a coin stamped with a stag listened to a man with scars talk about a wall that was not merely a thing men made to keep other men out but a line in a ledger in the sky, where green turned to white and numbers to something else. And in King's Landing, Stannis Baratheon listened to Davos tell him of a harbor where the ice broke too late and wolves came too near, and afterward the king walked alone upon the walls of the Red Keep. He looked out at the bay where ships sat like seeds upon a bowl, and he thought of the poor arithmetic of blood and the better arithmetic of bread. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not require it. He felt that a thing had been done honestly, and that it would hold until it did not, and that when it failed it would not be because he had failed in his part. He walked back along the wall. In his chamber, a fresh ledger lay open beside an old one, and beside them a letter from a man in Braavos whom he had never met and would never know. He sat. He took up his pen. He wrote, "Let the watch have their due. Beyond the black gate far to the north, where no coin opens any lock, the wind lifted a dusting of snow that had fallen on a sword whose owner no longer breathed. The snow skittered and settled again. The sky above the trees was a deep, exhausted blue. A raven sent from a tower in a hurry found a pocket of still air, rested there, feathered itself against the cold, and flew on, leaving behind a world that had not become just but had become, for a time, a shade more lawful. What that would mean when the dead began to walk was a matter no ledger had yet accounted for. But the men who would stand the first night stood in boots paid for by a bank's exactitude and ate from barrels paid for by a king's severity, and carried in their pockets small coins stamped with a stag that did not forget the weight of a boar's charge. When they set their feet, the sound they made upon the frozen ground was like the sound made by a pen upon paper. Scratch, pause, mark. In the years to come, some would say it had been a poor trade to let Bravos' ink seep into Westerosi veins. Others would say no trade had been made at all, merely a correction of an old and costly error. The Iron Bank remained as it had always been. A hoe. A sea on a canal where water and time wore stone to their will, where men counted and did not argue, where keys turned and doors opened and shut with a sigh that was not unlike a giant's breath. The crown remained what crowns are, a weight passed from head to head, neither kinder nor crueler for who bears it, only more or less honest. And Casterly Rock remained where it will always be, a red mountain cut by men into a promise and a threat, a house whose wealth could not quite buy all the things its lord desired, not even in a world where desire is the only honest coin. On winter mornings, the light came across Lannisport with the clarity of truth and the cold of justice. And in those mornings the men of the West stood in their doorways and looked at the harbor's quiet chain and did not speak of law or debt. They went to work as men do. They mended rope and they hauled fish, and they ate bread that had less seed than the bread they had eaten in summers past. They got by. In the rock's highest rooms, a man who had never once complained to a stone about the work it required wished, for the first time in his life, that stones might complain back, that he might be forced to listen to something that was not his own hard thought. But stones do not speak. Numbers do. Swords do. Men, sometimes in their better hours, find a way to make law speak. It had spoken long enough to set the world a little differently upon its axis. The rest would be war and winter and the slow compromise that makes living possible between them. In that middle place, where quiet occupies a chair it has not sat in much, the quill's whisper kept time. The Iron Bank will have its due. The crown will have its obligations. Men will live under both and curse both and, sometimes, bless both. The ships will come in on tides that do not care, and children will learn to count before they learn to cut. And once in a long while, a king will stand upon a wall and look at his city and think that for a moment, just a moment, he has done the thing a king must try to do, to keep a great, inhuman thing from falling upon the heads of those who cannot lift what falls. There are worse victories. There are not many better.